Where was Noah's Ark really built? For decades, this question has kept archaeologists in suspense. Although cuneiform tablets and archaeological layers point to a real city standing behind the flood tradition, scholars often treat these testimonies as beautiful mythology. But could the ancient chronicles be right? If so, how could a Bronze Age city prepare for an impossible disaster? Do echoes of that sacrifice still remain in our culture? And finally, what would make us prepare for catastrophe today? We will discover this together in this sleep documentary. Welcome. To begin, we must look at a small object of baked clay, about 20 by 9 centimeters, small enough to hold in one hand. Today, it sits in a quiet museum case in Oxford, England, covered in the dense wedge-shaped writing of a world that vanished almost 4,000 years ago. It is called the Weld-Blundell Prism. But this is not just a museum piece. It is a vessel of memory, a kind of hard drive made of earth. And what it preserves is one of the most unsettling records in ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian King List. At first, it looks like an official record of rulers, city by city, king by king, a memory of power stretching back into the mist of deep time. The list begins with a strange sentence. Kingship first descended from heaven. Then it names rulers from legendary cities and gives the length of their reigns. And this is where the numbers stop feeling human. One king is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000 years. It reads like a memory of a golden age, or a world so distant that ordinary history can no longer measure it. Then, after 8 kings and 5 cities, the scribe gives us the name of the last king of that first world, and the name of his city, Shuruppak. Immediately after that name, the text cuts history in two with one simple line. Then the flood swept over, Shuruppak, the last named city before the world broke. That single name changes the question. The story of the Great Flood is no longer only a myth about one man and one boat. It becomes a tradition anchored to a real place, a city standing on the edge between the world before and the world after. And this raises a much more interesting possibility. What if the story of the Ark did not begin as a private family project, but as a city-level crisis? If that question sparks your curiosity, we would be honoured to have you with us on this investigation. Like, subscribe, and comment with the location you're watching from, and let's explore this together. Our journey will follow the evidence where it leads, from the clay record of the city itself, to the warning tradition surrounding it, and finally, to the physical traces of water left in the ground. The King List gives us a name, so our first step is simple. Can we find the city of Shuruppak? The name on the prism gives the story a location. But to find a city nearly 5,000 years old, you don't look for standing walls or intact streets. You look for a wound in the flat landscape of southern Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. You look for a hill that doesn't belong. These are called tells, an Arabic word for a mound or small hill. But they aren't natural formations. A tell is an artificial mountain, built by accident over centuries, even millennia. A city is built, it thrives, it falls, or is abandoned. New people arrive and build on top of the levelled ruins. Again and again the cycle repeats. Layers of human life, of mud, brick, pottery, ash and bone, compress under their own weight, pushing the ground level higher and higher. A tell is not just a place, it is a stack of time, and in the sun-baked plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers there is a low, sprawling mound known to archaeologists as Tell Fara. This is it. This is the physical address. Tell Fara is the site of ancient Shuruppak. The last city named on the King List before the world broke now has a place on our map. The name from the mythic text corresponds to a layer of compressed earth you can stand on. But finding the location is not the end of the investigation. It's the beginning of a much more difficult problem. When a place is tied to such a powerful story, a story of gods, a world-ending flood, a single surviving family, the ground itself becomes charged with meaning. Every fragment of pottery, every trace of a wall, every layer of river-laid silt is pulled into the orbit of the myth. This is where excitement can lead to overclaiming, and where caution can lead to dismissing the mystery entirely. So the story is no longer just a story. It's now an archaeological question. Grounded in a real place, the stakes are higher. The convergence of a name from a sacred text with a physical mound of earth means we can't afford to be careless. Before we can even begin to look at what was found inside Tell Fara, we need a toolkit. We need a clear, honest method for navigating the layers of evidence, memory, and belief that are buried here. We need the rules for this trail. That line in the clay, the name Shuruppak, followed by the sentence that breaks the world, leaves us with a question that feels both simple and impossible. Is this story fact, or is it a myth? Is it a literal report of a lost history, or a symbolic tale about human fear and survival? But perhaps that's the wrong way to ask the question. Fact or myth is a flat two-dimensional choice for a memory that has survived for nearly 5,000 years, passed down through empires and written in languages that have long gone silent. A better question might be, how many layers does this story hold? To investigate a mystery this deep, we need a toolkit, a way to look at the evidence that is both honest and respectful. We will navigate this story using 5 distinct layers of reading. First, there is the source layer. This is simply what the ancient texts, the clay tablets themselves, actually say. The words on the surface with all their gaps, translations, and ambiguities. This is our foundation. Beneath that is the pattern layer. Here, we look for echoes. The warned survivor, the conflict among the gods, the vessel that carries life through a catastrophe. When we see these patterns repeating across different texts and traditions, we know we're touching a central nerve, a core memory of that ancient world. Next, we have the belief-based reading. This is the layer of sacred meaning. For the people who first told this story, and for many who hear it today, it is a living truth about the relationship between humanity and a higher power. It can be a memory of ancient teachers, a record of divine intervention, or a moral instruction. This layer holds the story's spiritual power, and we will give it its full measure of respect. Then comes the cautious reading. This is the layer of archaeology, of what we can hold in our hands. A physical tablet from a specific time, a layer of river silt in the ground at Tell Fara, a seal used for ancient accounting. This is the world of material evidence, and it tells us what can be physically supported and, just as importantly, what cannot. And finally, there is the open boundary. This is the space where the layers don't perfectly align, where honest questions remain, and where the mystery deepens. This is where we acknowledge what we do not know. This 5-layer approach isn't meant to debunk the story or explain it away. It's designed to honor every part of it, the poetry, the belief, and the physical traces, without pretending they are all the same thing. This method doesn't weaken our investigation, it makes it more powerful. It allows us to explore the most profound possibilities the story offers without ever losing our footing in the evidence. It turns us from passive listeners into careful explorers. So now we have our toolkit, a shared method for the journey ahead, built on transparency. With these rules established, we can lay out the map. We will follow 3 main trails of evidence to see where the layers of Shuruppak's story lead. So, with our method for reading these layers now in place, how do we approach a mystery as deep as Shuruppak? We follow the evidence. Not just one kind, but 3 distinct trails that run through this entire story. Think of it as opening a cold case dossier with 3 primary sections. We will track each one, pull on each thread to see where, and if, they converge. Our first line of investigation is the clay record. This is the city's own memory, baked into thousands of hand-sized tablets. It's the mundane, day-to-day accounting of grain, labour and resources. It's what the people of Shuruppak themselves thought was important enough to make permanent. This is our ground truth, the city's own voice. The second trail is the warned city. This is the story preserved in the mythic traditions. It speaks of a divine warning, of an impossible command to sacrifice the present to build a future, and of the vessel designed to carry life through a cataclysm. This thread holds the human drama, the pressure, and the core of the legend itself. And our third and final trail consists of the water traces. This is the physical evidence left in the earth, the geological and archaeological memory, a layer of silt, a change in a river's course, a drowned coastline. This is the silent witness, the story told not in words, but in sediment and soil. By keeping these 3 threads, the clay, the warning and the water, separate at first, we can investigate them honestly. It's the only way to see where the story told in myth truly aligns with the memory baked into a tablet, and where the marks in the earth support or challenge them both. This roadmap is our anchor. It's what ensures our journey into this deep past won't drift into baseless claims, but stays tethered to the tangible evidence. So now, the path forward is clear. We have our tools, and we have our map. You know exactly where this investigation is going, and why each piece matters. The mystery of the last city before the flood is no longer just a single, tangled story. It's a case we can now begin to solve. Our investigation begins with that first anchor, the clay record. What was this city thinking about, counting and planning for, right before the story remembers the world ending? Our investigation begins with that first anchor, the clay record. We have the city's name, and we have the line in the earth. But what was this city thinking about, right before its name became tied to the memory of a world-ending flood? What does it take for any civilization, ancient or modern, to even begin to contemplate its own survival? The answer, strangely, isn't found in a grand monument or a king's epic. It's found in something far more humble and far more powerful. It's found in the city's external memory, its civic nervous system baked into clay. These are the Fara tablets. Before a society can build a mythical vessel, or organize a rescue, or preserve its knowledge against a coming darkness, it must first master a fundamental skill. It must know how to count. Counting is the quiet superpower of civilization. To count the grain is to measure the future. To count the workers is to organize action. To count the days is to build a plan. Bureaucracy, which we think of as mundane, is the invisible machinery that allows a city to dream, to build, and perhaps to survive. So when we look at the hundreds of clay tablets dug from the earth at Tell Fara, we are not just looking at ancient paperwork. We are looking for a pulse, and this changes our question entirely. We are no longer asking, do these tablets contain a record of an ark? We are asking something more foundational, and far more revealing. Do these tablets show that this city was capable of such a story? We are about to look through Shuruppak's receipts, not to find a budget for a boat, but to measure the heartbeat of a civilization with the capacity to think about tomorrow and to write it down. So, when archaeologists uncovered more than 800 of these clay records at Tell Fara, what did they find this city was so carefully remembering? So, when archaeologists uncovered more than 800 of these clay records at Tell Fara, what did they find this city was so carefully remembering? The wedge-shaped marks don't speak of kings or gods or myths. They speak of the real, tangible world. They list barley and emmer wheat. They count livestock, sheep and goats. They track rations of beer and the distribution of tools. And most importantly, they list people, the names of workers, organised into teams assigned to tasks. At first glance, it might seem like the dry bookkeeping of any large enterprise. But when you look at the pattern, a different picture emerges. The tablets reveal a flow, a current of resources moving through the city. Grain wasn't just stored in every household. It was brought in from surrounding villages to a central authority, recorded, and then paid back out as wages, as rations, to the city's workers, from weavers to canal diggers. This is the clear signature of a highly centralized administration. Shuruppak wasn't a loose collection of farms. It was a coordinated economic engine, a hub that knew precisely what it had, what it owed, and who was doing the work. This wasn't just accounting for the present. This was a city calculating its future. It was a system designed for stability, for resilience, for looking beyond the next harvest. And this is where the mundane becomes profound. Because the ability to track every measure of grain, to allocate labour, to manage vast reserves of supplies, that is the exact same foundational logic required to undertake any massive coordinated survival effort. You cannot build an ark, literal or symbolic, if you cannot first count. You cannot preserve a society's future if you have no working memory of its present. The clay records don't show us a boat being built. They show us something more fundamental, a city with the mind of a builder. Shuruppak was a thinking machine, an entity capable of managing immense complexity long before the warning ever came. Counting resources is one thing. But how do you control them? How do you prevent loss and ensure the system is trusted? The answer lies in another small clay object. The tablets tell us what Shuruppak was counting, but another, even smaller clay object tells us how they controlled it. Alongside the thousands of administrative records, excavators found impressions left by one of the most elegant pieces of ancient technology, the cylinder seal. Think of a cylinder seal as a signature, a corporate logo, and a modern tamper-proof lock, all carved into one small cylinder of stone or shell. When an official rolled it across a patch of wet clay, it left a unique, repeating impression, a miniature endless frieze of gods, symbols, or scenes. This was their unforgeable identity, a mark of authority more personal than any typed name. This impression, called a sealing, was the engine of accountability. A little piece of clay pressed over the knot of a grain sack or used to seal the door of a storeroom was a guarantee. If that seal was unbroken, the contents were secure and the transaction was valid. If the seal was broken by the wrong person, it was an immediate, visible crime. Every important official, every temple storeroom, every major workshop had its own unique seal. It meant that every withdrawal of barley, every allocation of workers, every shipment of textiles could be authorized and verified. It transformed simple counting into a trusted system of control. This wasn't just bookkeeping. This was a sophisticated mechanism for managing the flow of life through the city, ensuring that what was counted was also secured. It demonstrates a level of civic organization that goes far beyond simple storage. And when a civilization builds a system this robust, one that can track and secure its collective wealth with such precision, it develops a new and powerful capability. With this kind of administrative machinery, a city's leaders could, in theory, redirect its entire metabolism. They could command and verify the movement of immense quantities of food, material and human labor, all focused toward a single, unprecedented goal. The tablets show us that Shuruppak knew what it possessed, but the seals show us that its leaders had control. It's this combination, knowledge plus command, that creates the capacity for civilization-scale projects, especially one that might be born from a desperate warning. A system of counting and control is impressive, but what did it feel like to be a person living inside this system? A system of counting and control of seals and silos is impressive, but a civilization is not its machinery. What about the people living inside this system? What did it feel like to be a person in the city of Shuruppak nearly 5,000 years ago? The clay tablets are not just ledgers, they are snapshots of daily life. They are pages from a city's diary baked into the earth. And when we look closely, the abstraction of a centralized administration dissolves into the movements of human beings. The tablets speak of work crews, teams of men and women assigned to maintain canals or bring in the harvest. They record the standardized rations of barley and oil allocated to each worker, not just a wage, but the very substance that would feed their family at the end of a long day. They track ownership of houses with reed-thatched roofs and the boundaries of fields along the life-giving river. This was the rhythm of the city, a predictable, organized and stable existence, managed from the center and recorded in the clay. The portion of grain was known. The work for the day was assigned. The house you returned to was registered. This was the world of Shuruppak, the baseline of normalcy, the steady heartbeat of a living community. And here, the great paradox of our story appears. The very system that provided this profound stability, this guarantee of a daily meal and a place in the world, is the only system that could possibly execute a project of civilizational survival. The same centralized power that could command 100 workers to dredge a canal is the only power that could command them to abandon that canal and build something else entirely. Through these tablets, Shuruppak is no longer just a name on a king list, or a testament to bureaucratic efficiency. It has become a home, populated by thousands of people whose lives, for a brief moment, were captured in these small clay records. We now have a reason to care what happens to them. So the clay record shows us a living, organized city with an immense capacity to get things done. But to continue our investigation with integrity, we have to be honest about what this evidence does not show. The clay record we've explored shows us a city with an almost unbelievable capacity for order. But to continue this investigation with integrity, we have to be clear about what that record does and does not show. This is where we draw a careful line in the dust. Think of it this way. The Fara tablets are like the blueprints for a factory. They show us the design, the scale, the immense potential to build something incredible. They prove the factory could operate. But they are not a photograph of the specific finished car that rolled off the assembly line. There are no tablets that read, "Reallocate bitumen for the great boat." There are no lists detailing rations for the ark builders. The records prove, without question, that Shuruppak could manage a vast city-wide project. They do not contain a specific ledger for that project, and this distinction is crucial. It's the line that separates a grounded inquiry from wishful thinking. Staying on the right side of that line is what allows the mystery to remain powerful. Because this boundary doesn't shut down the question, it makes it sharper, it makes it more profound. We're not left with a lack of evidence, but with a startling convergence. In one hand, we have a city with the proven, documented capability to organize a massive survival effort. In the other, we have one of humanity's oldest and most powerful myths about a massive survival effort. A myth that names that very city as its home. The convergence itself is the story. With this, the first pillar of our investigation, the clay record, is established on solid ground. We have a city that could. A city with the memory, the control, and the resources. Now, we can turn to the second pillar, the story of the warned city. How does the tradition remember the moment this hyper-organized world received a warning that it was all about to end? With the city's capability established, we can now turn to the second great pillar of our investigation, the myth itself. How does the story remember the moment this hyper-organized world received a warning that it was all about to end? According to the tradition, the decision came from a council of the gods. Humanity had become too numerous, too loud, and so a great flood was decreed to wipe the world clean. But one of them dissented. His name was Ea, known to the Sumerians as Enki, the god of wisdom and a protector of humankind. In this divine assembly, Ea became something we might recognize today, a whistleblower. He was bound by an oath to the other gods sworn to secrecy. He could not warn humanity directly of the coming destruction, and so he devised a plan. He went not to the king, not to the marketplace, but to the house of one man in Shuruppak. And he did not speak to the man, he spoke to the house itself. In the most cinematic moment in the tradition, Ea stands outside the man's dwelling, a structure woven from reeds common to the river valley, and he whispers his warning to the wall. Reed hut, wall, wall, he says. Reed hut, listen, wall, pay attention. The message passes through the physical boundary of the house, a divine secret carried on the air, intended for the ear of the man on the other side. This isn't just a clever way to bypass an oath. It's a powerful and recurring motif of forbidden knowledge. The knowledge that could save the world, the story insists, was not a public address. It couldn't be shouted from the ziggurat. It had to be leaked. This fact changes the entire feeling of the story. The warning does not create a prophet who can rally his city. It creates an isolated man burdened with a terrifying secret. The path to survival, it seems, does not begin with consensus or belief. It begins with a whispered warning that sets you against your entire world. So, the warning is delivered through a wall. But what exactly did the message command him to do? The secret warning from the god Ea is delivered through the reed wall. But the message itself is more shocking than the method. It is a command that seems to defy all logic, a two-part instruction that breaks the world of the person who hears it. The first part is an act of destruction. The second, an act of creation. Tear down your house, the voice says, and build a boat. This isn't a simple construction plan. It is a demand for profound sacrifice. Think of what a house meant in a city like Shuruppak. It wasn't just shelter. It was the physical record of a family's life, built and maintained over generations. It was stability. It was the source of a person's wealth and their standing in the community. To tear it down was to tear down your own past, to erase your identity in the present, all for a future that was not guaranteed. The command insists that the very materials of your security, the beams, the bricks, the foundation of your life, must be dismantled to become the raw material of your escape. The past must be sacrificed to build a vessel for the future. This is the price of heeding the warning. Survival, the story tells us, is not free. It demands that you personally unmake the world you know. And in doing so, the story reveals a devastating social truth. To prepare for a catastrophe that no one else can see, you must first appear to be a madman to your neighbours. You must actively destroy the very things that society values: property, stability, tradition, in order to save yourself from a threat that society does not yet recognise. It is an act of total isolation. The ark in this light is not a gift from the heavens, it is a cost. It is a vessel born from the wreckage of a a last resort built from the ruins of everything that once meant safety. And so we have to ask, imagine you are a citizen of Shuruppak, living your life according to the predictable rhythms of the clay tablets, and one day you see your neighbour, a respected man, begin to tear down his own house. What do you think? What do you do? The command is absolute. Destroy your home to build the vessel of survival. But this act of sacrifice is not performed in a vacuum. It happens in the middle of a city full of neighbours, of colleagues, of elders. Imagine being a citizen of Shuruppak, living your life according to the predictable rhythms of the clay tablets. One morning, you see your neighbour, a respected man, begin to tear down his own beautiful house, the very symbol of his stability and status. What do you think? We have a modern, if imperfect, parallel for this kind of social pressure. Think of someone today who becomes convinced a catastrophe is coming. They sell their assets, build a shelter, and stockpile resources, while everyone around them continues to live a normal life. They are seen as eccentric, perhaps unwell, an object of concern or even quiet ridicule. Now multiply that pressure by the cohesion of an ancient city, where community and conformity are the very bedrock of existence. The builder of the vessel would not just be an eccentric, he would be seen as a man who had lost his mind, a man actively destroying his family's wealth and future for a vision no one else can see. The questions would be relentless. The whispers in the market would follow him. His family would be shamed. The elders of the city, the keepers of its order, would surely intervene. They would ask him to explain this madness, this flagrant rejection of the life they have all built together. While he works frantically against an invisible clock, the city around him continues its life. Grain is measured and stored. Children learn their letters on wet clay. Life goes on, utterly oblivious, and in that contrast the true nature of the story reveals itself. This isn't just a story about a man against a flood. The real, primary conflict is the one who is warned versus the ones who are not. It's a story about the terrifying, crushing isolation of knowing a truth that separates you from your entire world. It's a drama of belief against disbelief, of foresight against the powerful inertia of the everyday. The pressure of the coming water is one thing, but the psychological weight of the warning, the burden of being the sole bearer of a world-ending secret that is a flood of its own, and it arrives long before the first drop of rain. This social pressure is immense, but there was also a physical cost. A project of this scale requires more than just the wood from one man's house. The project required more than just the wood from one man's house, and more than just his own 2 hands. A vessel of this scale demands a workforce, materials, and a supply chain. The logistics of the Ark, as remembered in the oldest traditions, were not a private hobby. They were a city-wide economic event driven by a single terrifying prophecy. Instead of just calculating dimensions, we should calculate the cost. What did it consume? The texts are remarkably clear on this point. The hero, Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, doesn't just start sawing planks. He hires professionals, carpenters, reed workers, and shipwrights. To keep them working, he provides for them on a royal scale. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes him slaughtering bullocks and sheep every single day. He gives his workers, quote, ale, beer, oil, and wine as if they were river water. This isn't a quiet backyard project. This is a feast, a festival of construction that must have been the talk of the entire city. It's a vortex of resources. Imagine the scene in Shuruppak. Day after day, a significant portion of the city's skilled labour is diverted to one man's inexplicable mega-project. Carts loaded with bitumen for waterproofing and tons of rope for binding clog the streets. The city's markets are strained as he buys up food and drink to fuel the work. He is liquidating his entire estate, his wealth, his livestock, his stores of grain, and pouring it all into this thing. The vessel becomes a black hole, consuming his past, his fortune, and his social standing. And so with every plank that is fitted, with every layer of bitumen that is applied, he is not just building a boat, he is completing his separation. Each swing of the hammer is an act of departure from the world of the living, a final commitment to a future that only he believes is coming. The construction itself is the last and most public act of sacrifice, the final burning of his bridges to the world that was. The Ark is no longer just a plan or a warning, It is a physical reality, a monument to his isolation. The vessel is finally complete. Now, the most important question of all, what was it designed to carry? The great vessel is finished. It stands against the sky, a monument of wood and reeds and bitumen, born from a warning that could not be spoken aloud. The cost has been paid in wealth, in reputation, in the stability of a settled life. And now comes the final, most important question of all. What does it carry? The most familiar layer of the story gives us a clear answer. The hero's family, his wife and sons, and their wives, and then the animals loaded in pairs to preserve their kind. But the oldest texts use a phrase that is both simpler and infinitely more profound. The command was not just to save animals, but to preserve the seed of all life. At first, we hear that literally. The seed of the harvest, the precious grains of barley and emmer wheat that must be planted in the New World soil, the biological seed, the genetic code carried within the creatures of the field and sky. But the tradition invites a deeper reading. What is the seed of a craft? It isn't an object. It's the knowledge that lives in the hands and eyes of a master weaver, the muscle memory that knows the tension of the loom. It's the potter's feeling for the clay, the boat builder's understanding of the wood. These are skills passed from one living person to another. To save the craft, you must save the craftsman. The cargo then must include the teachers, and what is the seed of a society? It is the story of its own origin. It is the memory of its laws, the rhythm of its songs, the names of its gods and ancestors. This is the invisible architecture that allows people to live together, to rebuild, to remember who they are. Without this seed, survivors are just isolated beings. With it, they are a people. The vessel in this reading must carry not just life, but the instructions for living. This reframes the entire project. The great boat is no longer just a lifeboat, a crude vehicle for physical escape. It is a vessel of continuity. It is a carefully curated archive, designed to carry an entire world system across a catastrophic gap in time. The story, then, is not just about saving the hardware, the physical bodies of people and animals. It is about saving the operating system of their civilization. It is an act of preservation aimed at ensuring that the survivors don't just endure, but that they have the tools, the skills, and the cultural memory needed to truly begin again. The cargo of the Ark in this light is the future itself. It is the past, concentrated and distilled into its most essential forms, carried as the precious seed for a world not yet born. This man, tasked with carrying the seed of a future world, is known by several names in the Mesopotamian texts. Who was he? This man, tasked with carrying the seed of a future world, is known by several names in the Mesopotamian texts: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. At first glance, this might seem like a list of contradictions, a sign of a muddled or unreliable myth. But it's more revealing to think of them not as different people, but as different portraits of the same essential figure, painted by different generations across a vast span of time. They are layers in a single living tradition. In the oldest surviving Sumerian version, he is Ziusudra, the king from the city of Shuruppak itself, the original survivor whose name means he saw life. Later, in the great Akkadian epic, he is Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, the one who receives the detailed warning through the reed wall and understands the politics of the gods. And finally, in the most famous version from the Epic of Gilgamesh, he becomes Utnapishtim, the immortal elder, the distant one who has survived the flood and tells his story to the hero Gilgamesh as a solemn warning. These are not three separate floods, or three competing histories. They are echoes of one continuous cultural memory, passed down, translated and retold for well over 1,000 years. And the fact that this character persists, that the story was so important it survived the shift from the Sumerian language to Akkadian, shows how central this story of the warned survivor was. This wasn't just one story among many. It was a foundational part of how this civilization understood its own past, the precarity of its world, and its relationship with forces beyond its control. What this means for our investigation is that we are dealing with a core cultural paradigm, not a forgotten folktale. We are tracing a deep recurring story about a terrible break in the world, and the one person chosen to carry the spark of continuity across that break. With this powerful tradition of a warned survivor in mind, we can now make the central turn of our investigation, and ask a more profound question about what, precisely, the Ark was designed to carry. With this powerful, unified tradition of a warned survivor in mind, we arrive at the central turn of our investigation. We can now ask a more profound question about the Ark's true purpose. What was it truly designed to save? Was it simply a lifeboat, a desperate vessel meant to keep a handful of creatures afloat until the waters receded? Or was it something more, a civilizational hard drive? This is where we enter a powerful belief-based reading of the tradition. In this view, the Ark is not just a container for life, but a memory machine. Its primary mission is not just biological survival, but informational and cultural continuity. The animals, the family, the seeds, they are essential, but they are like the software needed to run a new world. The Ark itself in this reading carries the operating system. It holds the instructions, the ancestral knowledge, the divine sciences, the memory of how to build, how to plant, how to organize, and how to live. It is a curated archive of the world that was about to be erased. This reading completely reframes the story. The core mission shifts from saving bodies to saving a blueprint for civilization. Suddenly, the actions of the flood hero are not just about personal survival, but about being the custodian of a legacy that stretches back into the deep past. And if this is true, then the flood itself becomes something more than a natural disaster. It is a civilizational reset button, a moment where the world's memory is wiped clean, except for the one single backup file carried in a sealed vessel, waiting to reboot reality on the other side of the catastrophe. This interpretation elevates the story into a profound meditation on a question every culture must face. What knowledge is most worth saving? What information is so essential that it must be carried at any cost into the next world? This is a powerful reading, but does the Mesopotamian tradition itself contain texts that are specifically about preserving knowledge from before the flood? The reading of the Ark as a civilizational backup is a powerful one. But does the Mesopotamian tradition itself contain any texts that are specifically about preserving knowledge from before the flood? Is there a source layer that directly supports this belief-based reading? There is. It is an extraordinary piece of writing called the Instructions of Shuruppak. To understand its importance, it helps to see it not just as a tablet, but as a letter from a father to his son, a letter sent across the abyss of the flood. It is one of the oldest surviving examples of wisdom literature on Earth, and the names it uses are what stop you cold. In this text, the father giving the advice is named Shuruppak, and the son, the one receiving the wisdom of the old world, is named Ziusudra, the very same hero who in the Sumerian tradition survives the Great Flood. The instructions are not a blueprint for a boat, they are a blueprint for a just society. They are a collection of proverbs, warnings, and practical advice on how to live, how to build a family, how to farm, and how to navigate the complexities of being human. Do not steal, it advises, do not kill. Do not pass judgment when you drink beer. It is the operating system of a culture written down for the next generation. This provides a concrete example, from within their own literary world, of a body of pre-flood knowledge being intentionally packaged for transmission to the post-flood world. The text itself performs the act of preservation, and here is the turn. The tradition suggests that the most critical inheritance, the thing passed from the father to the son, from the world before to the world after, was not only the vessel that saves life, but the wisdom that makes life worth living. It is not enough to survive the catastrophe. You must carry the means to rebuild a meaningful world on the other side. This text does not prove that the Ark contained a physical library of tablets, but it provides a powerful anchor for reading the entire tradition as a story about preserving continuity. It shows that the idea of safeguarding wisdom, of carrying the moral and practical code of civilization forward, was woven directly into the memory of the city Shuruppak and its most famous son. So the tradition remembers a set of instructions being passed down from one world to the next. But in the belief-based reading of this story, where did that knowledge originate? Who were the first teachers? In the deepest layers of Mesopotamian tradition, we find a group of extraordinary figures known as the Apkallu. These were not kings or warriors. They are remembered as the 7 great sages, the original culture bearers, or ancient teachers of humanity. The tradition holds that they were servants of the god Ea, or Enki, the same divine figure who broke ranks to warn the flood hero. They were said to have emerged from the waters in the most ancient times to live among the earliest people, and their purpose was not to rule, but to instruct. According to the memory encoded in the myths, the Apkallu brought the foundational arts of civilization. They delivered the blueprints for society, the principles of law and justice, the craft of building cities and temples, the secrets of writing on clay, the knowledge of medicine, of irrigation, of the patterns in the stars. In essence, they are remembered as having delivered the operating system for a complex human world. They were the teachers of the time before the flood, establishing order and giving humanity the tools to build something far greater than scattered villages. Their memory is that of a foundational age of direct instruction, a time when wisdom was not struggled for but given. Now, this is a crucial moment in our investigation. This story of the Apkallu falls squarely into what we have called the belief-based reading. It's the culture's own profound explanation for its origins, a powerful, self-contained narrative about where its foundational knowledge came from. We aren't looking at an archaeological report here. We are listening to the deep memory of a civilization explaining itself to itself. And in this reading, the flood takes on an even deeper, more tragic meaning. It is no longer just a natural disaster that destroys cities and lives. It is the cataclysm that cuts humanity off from its divine teachers. The flood is the moment the classroom door closes forever. The sages are gone, either returned to the depths or lost in the destruction. The age of direct revelation is over. Suddenly the Ark project, that frantic command to destroy your house and build a boat, is not just about saving a family and some animals. It becomes a desperate, last-ditch effort to preserve a fragment of the teachings of the Apkallu. It is an attempt to create a time capsule of the world's first, and perhaps greatest, inheritance. This layer of the tradition then gives us a powerful, coherent answer to the question of why knowledge preservation was so critical. The cargo of the Ark wasn't just random information, it was the echo of a lost golden age, the last surviving syllabus from the world's original teachers. This transforms our central question. If the Ark was a vessel for knowledge from a lost world, a civilizational hard drive carrying the teachings of the Apkallu, what specific information would be so valuable that it needed to survive the end of everything? If the Ark was a vessel for knowledge from a lost world, what specific information would be so valuable that it needed to survive the end of everything? What would be in that civilizational backup file? It's like packing an emergency go bag, but not for a person, for an entire world. The contents wouldn't be random. They would have to be a curated essential toolkit for a full reboot. First, you would need the practical knowledge, the hardware of society, how to plant and when to harvest, which seeds to save and how to save them, the principles of animal husbandry, how to fire bricks, how to cut stone, how to build a simple shelter that keeps out the rain, how to find and manage clean water. This is the foundational layer, the knowledge that separates survival from extinction. But a world is more than just food and shelter. The next layer in this archive would have to be civic, the social software, the principles of law and justice that allow people to live together without tearing each other apart, the methods for organizing labor not by force, but by shared purpose, the memory of how to resolve disputes, and finally, you would need the cultural and sacred knowledge, the operating system itself, the calendar, rooted in the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, which tells you not just when to plant, but who you are in the cosmos, the stories of creation and meaning, the ethical frameworks that give a society its soul. It's not just a library of facts, it's a complete toolkit for what it means to be human, as understood by that world. And this reading raises a sharp, uncomfortable question for us. Our civilization has created more information in the last decade than in all of prior history. But are we creating a toolkit this robust? Or are we simply accumulating data, scattered and fragile, without curating the essential wisdom? The belief-based reading of the Ark as a memory machine forces us to see the profound difference between raw information and the usable world-building knowledge needed to begin again. The tradition isn't just remembering a boat, it's remembering the idea that a civilization's most precious asset is the blueprint for its own existence. This reading of the Ark as an archive of wisdom is powerful, but now, as promised by our method, it's time to step back from the world of text and tradition. we must return to the cautious reading and ask a different question. What does the physical evidence in the ground actually support? This reading of the Ark as a civilizational hard drive is powerful. It resonates with a deep human instinct that survival is more than just breathing, it's remembering. But now, as we promised at the start of our journey, it is time to return to our framework, to gently step away from the belief-based reading and into the layer of the cautious reading. This is where we must ask, with respect for the tradition, what does the physical and textual evidence actually support? The boundary is this. The texts absolutely support a powerful, persistent motif of knowledge preservation. The document called the Instructions of Shuruppak is real. The tradition of the Apkallu sages, the culture bearers, is real. But there is no archaeological evidence, no tablet, no inscription from the ruins of any city that describes a physical, technical library or a collection of scientific blueprints being loaded onto the Ark. This does not mean the belief-based reading is wrong. It simply means its truth operates on the level of myth and meaning and cultural memory, not on the level of material fact. The mystery isn't invalidated, it just lives in a different layer of reality. And here is the crucial turn. The power of this story doesn't depend on us finding a physical library baked into a clay tablet. The real power is in the idea itself, the fact that a civilization, thousands of years ago, was so profoundly concerned with the fragility of its own knowledge, so aware that a catastrophe could wipe its operating system, that it wove this instinct for preservation into its most foundational survival myth. That is a truth about the human condition that needs no further proof. We have now explored two of our three pillars. We have seen the clay record of a capable city, and we have listened to the story of the warned city, finding a profound parable about memory. Now, we turn to our third and final pillar of investigation, the water traces. After all the stories, all the beliefs, and all the interpretations, did the water itself leave a mark in the ground? Is there a physical trace of a great flood at the city of Shuruppak? We have followed the story through clay tablets and divine whispers. We have explored the human cost of a warning and the belief that an ark could carry not just life, but the very blueprint of a civilization. But after all the texts and all the interpretations, a fundamental question remains. Is there any trace of a great flood in the ground itself, at the last city before the world broke? To find out, we must go to the excavation trenches of Tell Fara, ancient Shuruppak. Archaeology is a conversation with time, and the language it speaks is stratigraphy. You can think of it like this. The earth is a book, and every layer of settlement, every floor of a house, every buried wall is a page. The deeper you dig, the further back in time you read. Each layer tells a story of who lived there, what they built, and how their world ended, covered by the dust of ages, waiting for the next chapter to be built on top. It is a slow, careful reading of time written in dirt and debris. And as excavators read the book of Shuruppak, they found something that stopped them cold. They dug down through layers of city life, pottery, tools, the foundations of homes. Then, the pages of human activity simply stopped. They hit a thick, uniform, unbroken layer of clean yellow water-laid silt, an alluvial deposit, completely sterile. There were no artifacts, no ash, no signs of human life within it. It was a thick, silent page of nothing but water and mud. And then, directly on top of that sterile layer, the book of the city began again. A new occupation layer appeared, with new homes and new pottery. The sequence was unmistakable. A thriving city, then a devastating flood, then a new city built on the ruins of the old. This is the moment. This is the place where the two threads of our investigation, the memory and the material, finally converge. For thousands of years, the story was carried in the delicate wedge marks of cuneiform script. It was preserved in the warnings of a god and the desperate acts of a survivor. But here, in the wall of an excavation trench, the story becomes visible in the earth itself. This isn't just dirt. It is a physical memory written in sediment. It is the signature of a catastrophe so complete that it washed away the city that was, leaving behind a blank slate of mud before human life could return. The story spoke of a flood that swept over the land. And here, beneath the dust of millennia, is a layer of silt that did exactly that. We have found a tangible trace of a massive flood, at the very city the tradition names as the home of the one who survived it. This doesn't prove every detail of the myth, but the convergence is powerful and it is real. The layer in the ground is an answer, but it opens an even more urgent question. What kind of flood could do this? What natural force is powerful enough not just to inundate a city, but to wipe its slate clean, creating the memory of a world destroyed by water? That layer of silt between the layers of human life is a physical fact. But what kind of force could lay it down? To understand the water in the ground at Shuruppak, we have to understand the rivers that gave the region life, and sometimes took it away. The process has a geological name, river avulsion, but a technical term doesn't capture the scale of it. It's better to think of it this way. A great river, like the Tigris or the Euphrates, is not just a channel of water, it is a highway for an entire landscape. For thousands of years, that highway carries not just water, but immense loads of silt and sand from the mountains upstream. Year after year, flood after flood, the river drops that sediment along its path, slowly building up its own bed. Over centuries, the river can actually raise itself up, so that its own highway is flowing high above the surrounding plain, contained only by its natural banks. And then, one day, the pressure becomes too great. The highway breaks. This isn't a gentle overflow, it is a catastrophic failure. The river abandons its old course entirely and carves a new one, miles wide, straight across the flat, fertile land where people have built their cities, dug their canals and planted their fields. This is not a gentle rising of water. It is a violent, landscape-altering event, a moving wall of water and mud that can bury entire regions in a single season. For the people living in its path, an avulsion event would be, quite simply, the end of their world. It would look and feel exactly like the flood of the myths, a force from which there is no escape, a power that erases everything. And so, we don't necessarily need a global, ocean-covering deluge to find the source of a memory that powerful. The river system itself, the very source of life in Mesopotamia, was perfectly capable of producing a world-ending flood, all on its own. If this kind of catastrophic river flood was possible, the question becomes, was the layer at Shuruppak an isolated event, or was it part of a much larger, more terrifying pattern? If the layer of earth at Shuruppak was the testimony of a broken world, the first question an investigator must ask is, was it the only witness? Or did other cities in that ancient river valley have a story of their own buried in the clay? To move from a single data point to a pattern, we need corroborating accounts. In this case, the witnesses are not people, but the silent layers of earth beneath the great mounds of southern Mesopotamia. And when archaeologists looked, they found that Shuruppak was not alone. The most famous of these other witnesses was found at the city of Ur, the legendary home of Abraham, a powerhouse of Sumerian civilization. There, in the 1920s, the archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley drove a deep shaft into the ground, cutting down through millennia of history. He went past royal tombs, past temples, past the layers of ordinary life, and then he hit a layer of clean, water-laid clay. It was a massive deposit, in some places more than 3 meters thick. Below it, the signs of human life began again, but with different pottery, different tools. It was a sterile, silent interruption in the story of the city. Woolley, struck by the sheer scale of the deposit, famously declared he had found evidence of the Great Flood. A similar, though distinct story was found at the ancient city of Kish, another seat of kingship. There too, a band of river sediment separated different ages of the city's life, a physical line drawn in the ground by water. Now, it's crucial to understand that these layers are not perfectly aligned in time. They don't form a single universal blanket proving one synchronous event across the entire plain. Instead, they suggest something more complex and perhaps more powerful. The great myths are rarely a simple photograph of a single event. More often, they are like a composite image, the blending of many different faces to create one archetypal face. The flood tradition may be a form of compressed memory. It might take the terror of a dozen different catastrophic floods, happening over centuries in different cities, and focus them into the narrative of one ultimate world-ending disaster. The story isn't about a flood, it's about the flood. It preserves the essential truth of the environment, and this is where the meaning turns. If this is a pattern, then the flood was not a one-time monster that appeared from beyond the horizon, was defeated, and then vanished from history. It was a constant, lurking pressure. It was the fundamental condition of life in that world. To live in the Mesopotamian plain was to know in your bones that the very same river that gave you fertile soil, that allowed your city to thrive, could rise up in a single season of terrible rain and erase everything you had built. The world was not stable. The water was both life-giver and world-ender. This recurring threat, this deep environmental anxiety, would have shaped their cosmology, their view of the gods, and their understanding of humanity's fragile place in the cosmos. What the geology shows us, then, is not necessarily proof of a single mythic event. It shows us the source code for the myth itself. The pattern of real, repeated, city-destroying trauma is precisely the kind of force that would forge a story so powerful it would be told and retold for thousands of years. The memory wasn't just in the clay tablets, it was written into the very land they lived on. So we have a real layer, a real mechanism, and a regional pattern of trauma. But as always, we must be precise about what this proves and what it does not. So here, at the boundary where the earth meets the story, we must be precise. The layers of silt and clay provide a powerful convergence, but they are not a blank check for belief. Think of it like a courtroom. The geological evidence places a known suspect, a catastrophic city-destroying flood, at the scene of the crime. We have the physical trace of water and we have a victim, a civilization's sense of security. But this evidence doesn't prove the exact narrative told by the witnesses, the ancient texts. What the alluvial layers at Shuruppak, Ur and Kish provide is the plausible physical origin for the myth. They confirm that world-ending floods were a real and terrifying feature of the Mesopotamian landscape. They are the geological signature of a constant and memorable trauma. What they do not prove is the single, divinely sent global flood of the tradition. They do not give us a biography for Ziusudra, nor do they provide a manifest for his vessel. This is the cautious reading of the evidence. It respects the physical trace for what it is, the memory of water written into the earth. But this careful boundary doesn't diminish the power of the story. In fact, it deepens it. A story born from pure fantasy is one thing, a story forged in the memory of real loss, passed down through generations who knew the rivers could break their banks and erase a world overnight. That story carries a different kind of weight. It's no longer just a myth, it's the echo of a real human trauma. We have now followed our third investigative thread, the water traces, to a point of powerful convergence, but also a clear and honest limit. The story of Shuruppak is one of a river valley. But what if the deepest memory of a flood came not from a river, but from the sea? The story of Shuruppak is one of a river valley, a landscape defined by water that gives life and water that takes it away. But what if the deepest, most persistent memory of a flood came not from a river that overflowed its banks, but from the sea? Look at a map of the modern world, and the Persian Gulf is a vast, blue expanse of water. But for much of our deeper history it was not there. After the great glaciers of the last ice age began their long retreat, all that locked-up water had to go somewhere. The oceans of the world began to rise by hundreds of feet, and shorelines that had been stable for millennia began to move. Coastlines were not erased in a single day, but over generations the sea advanced, reclaiming the land. And the land that is now the Persian Gulf was, according to a compelling hypothesis, not a desert, but a well-watered river valley. For thousands of years this was the Gulf Oasis, a fertile floodplain fed by the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers, creating a sanctuary for wildlife and almost certainly for people. As the Indian Ocean pushed inward, this world was slowly, inexorably drowned. For any people living in that valley, the experience would have been unlike any river flood. This was a flood that did not recede, it was a transgression. In a slow-motion apocalypse where the world's edge kept creeping closer, each generation would have told stories of shorelines that were now lost, of fishing grounds and sacred places that were now out at sea. Their entire world, the cradle of their ancestors, would have vanished beneath the rising water. Could the Mesopotamian flood myths, stories that became so central to Shuruppak's identity, be a distant, layered cultural memory of this much older, much larger catastrophe? A memory not just of a river breaking its banks for a week, but of a homeland lost forever to the sea. The Gulf Oasis hypothesis is a powerful reminder that some of the most important chapters of the human story may now be physically inaccessible to us, lost beneath the waves. It doesn't prove the story of a single ark, but it offers a profound context for a culture haunted by the memory of a drowned world. The possibility of a history lost under the Gulf leads to a critical question. How much of the past is missing simply because it was made of the wrong stuff or built in the wrong place? The possibility of a history lost beneath the waters of the Gulf leads us to one of the most important tools an investigator of the deep past can possess. It's a concept called preservation bias. To understand it, imagine that all of history is a single vast library. One night, a fire sweeps through it. When the smoke clears, we can only read the books that didn't burn. We find volumes carved in stone and a few baked clay tablets. But the millions of scrolls written on papyrus, the stories written on leather, the knowledge bound in wood and cloth, all of that is gone. If we were to write the history of that library based only on what survived, we would believe it was a library made entirely of stone and clay. We would be wrong. The archaeological record is that burned library. What survives from the past is not a representative sample. It is an archive of the durable and the lucky. Stone survives. Fired pottery and baked clay tablets survive. But the vast worlds built of wood, of woven reed, of packed earth, of animal hide, those worlds largely vanish. A settlement built on a coastline that is now underwater is far less likely to survive than a city built on a dry inland plateau. An oral story, passed from one mind to another, is infinitely more fragile than a text carved into a temple wall. We are, therefore, reading the past through a distorted lens, a lens biased towards what could resist decay and disaster. And this means the most important sentence any honest investigator must remember is this: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A civilization that built its world from timber on a shoreline that has since been drowned by rising seas would be almost completely invisible to us. Their silence in the archaeological record wouldn't mean they never existed. It would only mean they built their world with the wrong materials in the wrong place for it to survive into our time. Understanding this bias is not an excuse for baseless speculation. It is a tool for intellectual honesty. It reminds us to ask not just, what evidence do we have, but also, what evidence could have been erased? It keeps the boundary of mystery open with discipline and respect. To truly feel the power of what should have been erased but wasn't, to see an example of preservation so unlikely it feels like a ghost story written in the earth, we must leave Mesopotamia behind. We have to travel halfway around the world to a white desert in what is now New Mexico. To understand how profoundly history can be erased and how strangely it can survive, we have to leave Mesopotamia behind. We travel halfway around the world and more than 10,000 years deeper into the past to a windswept basin of white sand in what is now New Mexico. Here, preserved in the pale ground of an ancient lake bed, are fossilized ghosts. Not bones, not tools, not walls, but footprints. They are the tracks of Ice Age people, left on the muddy shores of what was once Lake Otero. Dated to around 23,000 years ago, they are a story written in mud, then frozen in time. You can see the long, straight tracks of adults on a journey, and beside them, the smaller, more chaotic prints of children playing as they went. For a few brief moments, a family, a community, walked across this shore, and the soft ground remembered. This memory is not a monument built to last. It is the opposite. It is the most fragile, intimate trace imaginable. The simple pressure of a human foot, an act that should have vanished in an instant. And this is the turn that recalibrates our entire sense of time. The oldest cities of Sumer, like Shuruppak, emerged thousands and thousands of years after these steps were taken. Before the first clay tablet was ever pressed, before the first king was ever named on a prism, people were walking this land. Their world of wood and hide and story and memory has almost completely vanished. But the ground, in this one specific place, held on to a single afternoon. It tells us that what survives the deep past is not always what was strongest or what was meant to be remembered. Sometimes, a simple walk by a lakeside can outlast an empire. A footprint is the trace of a person. But what does the trace of an entire society look like, especially one that also challenges our assumptions about what can be built and when? A single footprint is the trace of a person, a moment of presence that outlasted its maker. But what does the trace of an entire society look like? especially one that rewrites the rules of what we thought was possible. To find one, we travel from the dry lake beds of the southwest to the lush floodplains of Louisiana, to a site now known as Poverty Point. At first glance, it might look like a set of strange, gentle hills, but from above, a breathtaking design reveals itself. 6 enormous C-shaped earthen ridges, nested one inside the other, facing a plaza and a series of massive mounds. It feels like a Bronze Age earthwork cathedral, built by people who, according to the old models, shouldn't have had a Bronze Age. This entire complex was engineered and constructed between about 3,700 and 3,100 years ago. And here is the fact that changes the equation. It was built by a society of hunter-fisher-gatherers. For generations, the standard story of civilization was a neat linear progression. First, you invent agriculture. Then, with surplus food, you build permanent villages, which grow into cities, which then, and only then, allows for the organization and labor required for monumental public works. But the people of Poverty Point accomplished this without large-scale farming. They coordinated the labor of thousands, moving millions of cubic feet of earth in woven baskets to build a sacred landscape that served as a vast ceremonial and trade center for centuries. And here, the parallel to our city in the Mesopotamian dust becomes clear. Just as the clay tablets of Shuruppak revealed an administrative capacity, a civic nervous system, far more complex than we might assume, Poverty Point reveals a social and engineering capacity that defies our simple labels. It is a testament to a level of organization, belief, and shared purpose that left a permanent mark, proving that a complex world can be hidden in plain sight. It is another form of memory, not written in clay, but sculpted from the earth itself. Poverty Point shows a society reshaping a landscape to reflect its worldview. But what happens when that same impulse to build, that same ability to organize thousands, doesn't just shape the land, but creates a city that would dominate it, a city larger than London was at the same time? Poverty Point shows a society reshaping the earth. But what happens when that impulse builds a city larger than London was at the same time? Across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, a different kind of memory is written into the landscape. Here, around the year 1100 Common Era, stood the great metropolis of ancient North America, a city we now call Cahokia. At its peak, it was home to as many as 20,000 people, with thousands more living in satellite communities. Its influence, its trade, stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The city itself sprawled across nearly 1,600 hectares, a landscape defined by more than 120 man-made earthen mounds. At its heart stood the largest of them all, a colossal terraced pyramid now known as Monk's Mound. It rises in 4 stages to a height of 30 meters, about 100 feet. But its footprint is the real shock. Monk's Mound is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was not a simple village or a ceremonial outpost. It was a true urban center, a seat of power, commerce and belief on a scale that for a long time was thought impossible for this part of the world. And yet, for centuries, this indigenous American achievement was effectively erased from the popular story of the continent. Early theories often attributed the mounds to a mythical lost race of builders, unable to accept that the ancestors of living native peoples could have engineered such a place. Cahokia became a lost world hiding in plain sight, its memory suppressed, its complexity downplayed. The city is therefore a double monument. It is a testament to the sheer scale of what can be built, a civilization of earth and water and starlight, and it is a testament to the scale of what can be forgotten, a warning that even the largest things can be made invisible when a story's broken, a footprint, an earthwork, a forgotten city. What do these American sites, so far from Shuruppak, teach us about our central theme of memory? A fleeting human story written in the mud of an ancient lake bed, a manual of social organization sculpted from the earth itself, and a sprawling political epic, its central mound larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. White Sands, Poverty Point, Cahokia. These are not chapters in the story of Shuruppak. They are books from an entirely different library, on a continent half a world away. So why did we travel here? To be clear, these places hold no direct evidence for the events in Mesopotamia. Their purpose in our journey is that of a parallel, a powerful mirror held up to our central question. They teach us to see memory in its many forms, They show us that it can be preserved in the fragile trace of a footprint, in the monumental curve of an earthen mound, or in the silent geometry of a great house aligned to the sun and moon, just as it can be pressed into a clay tablet. But these sites teach us something more profound and more unsettling. For centuries, the true scale, age, and complexity of these places were misunderstood, undervalued, or attributed to anyone but the indigenous ancestors who conceived of them. The Epic of Cahokia was dismissed. The ingenuity of Poverty Point was underestimated. The story of human presence written at White Sands was thought to be impossible. This is the turn. The most important lesson from this American journey is that the problem of preservation is universal. Even a history written in 1,000,000 tons of earth can be effectively erased by a failure of memory. The greatest monuments can become invisible if we lose the story that makes them meaningful. This journey across a continent and across millennia wasn't a detour. It was a recalibration of our senses, expanding our understanding of what a civilizational memory looks like and reminding us just how fragile it can be. Armed with this wider sense of how memory can be written and how it can be lost, it is time to return to the dust of Mesopotamia and bring our three threads, the clay record, the warned city, and the water traces, to their final convergence. Let us return to a single object, a tablet of baked clay from Shuruppak, held in the palm of a hand. It is a simple thing, a record of grain, a list of workers. But place it now beside the other traces we have followed, beside a line of yellow silt cutting through the dark earth of an archaeological trench, beside another, more famous tablet that tells of a man who survived a world-drowning storm. And place it, finally, beside the quiet, immense curve of an earthen mound in North America, a silent monument to a forgotten city. At first, they seem unrelated. A receipt, a scar, a poem, a hill. But now, the threads begin to converge. We have followed the clay record, the proof of a real city, Shuruppak, with the administrative power to organize its world, to count its future, and to remember what it owned. We have followed the story of the warned city, the potent myth that clung to this specific place, a story of a secret warning, an impossible sacrifice, and a vessel built to carry life across a catastrophic boundary. We have followed the water traces, the geological memory in the land itself, the signature of river floods so vast they could erase a city from the map and fuel a world-ending memory for 1,000 years. And we looked across the ocean and saw in the footstep, the earthwork and the mound, the same universal pattern, that great and complex worlds can be built, and that their memory can be almost completely erased from the earth. Each of these threads, the clay, the myth, the water, the distant echo, all point toward a single, central human obsession. This is the great secret hiding in the story of the Ark. The ultimate project of any civilization is not merely to build or to conquer, or even to live. It is the fight against forgetting. It is the desperate, unending struggle to ensure that what we learn, what we build, and who we are is not scoured from the record by time and catastrophe. The vessel is not just for bodies, it is for continuity. The cargo is not just life, it is the operating system for the next world. Seen through this lens, Shuruppak is no longer just an ancient city. It becomes a symbol of this universal struggle, a place where the memory of a real city, the memory of a real disaster, and the profound need to remember converged, creating a story that has survived for 5,000 years. This ancient fight against forgetting has never been more relevant. To understand why, we need to compare their method of preservation with our own. Here are two technologies for storing a world. One is 5,000 years old. The other, perhaps 5. One is a simple piece of baked river mud, small enough to fit in your hand. The other is a miracle of cleanroom engineering and quantum physics, and these two objects are locked in a duel. It is a contest between two completely different ideas of what it means to remember, a fight between profound durability and terrifying fragility. The clay tablet can hold one contract, one ledger, one verse of a story. To read it, you need only sunlight and knowledge of the symbols. Fire makes it stronger, water can submerge it for millennia, and when it dries, its message remains. It can be buried under a fallen city, and it will wait patiently for a future hand to unearth it. It is, for all intents and purposes, a piece of manufactured stone. The hard drive can hold 1 billion tablets. It can store every book ever written, every song ever recorded, every image ever captured. Its capacity is functionally infinite, but its vulnerability is absolute. A fall can shatter its platters. Water will destroy its electronics. A magnetic pulse can wipe it clean. And most critically, without a global network of compatible hardware, software, and a stable electrical grid to power it all, it is a silent, useless brick. To an archaeologist 5,000 years from now, the tablet is a library. The hard drive is a rock. There is no question which of these technologies has built our modern world. We have created the most powerful, data-rich, information-generating civilization in human history. And in doing so, we may have also created the most forgetful. Our entire collective memory is stored on brittle, temporary platforms that require a fully functioning industrial civilization just to be accessed. The people of Shuruppak baked their memory into the earth itself, giving it the permanence of geology. We have suspended ours on a whisper of electricity. This uncomfortable truth forces us to ask the same question the Sumerians encoded in their myth. And so, this 5,000-year-old story lands squarely in our present moment, forcing us to ask the one question that echoes from the reed walls of Shuruppak. If the water came for us, if our world faced a fundamental break, what would our ark carry? We have our own attempts, of course. Deep in the permafrost of a Norwegian mountain, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault holds the genetic memory of our agriculture. Nearby, the Arctic World Archive stores data on durable film, hoping to outlast the decay of our digital age. These are our modern arcs of information and life. But what is truly essential? What knowledge must survive a civilizational reset? Is it the hard data, the periodic table, the laws of physics, the sequences of our own genome? Is it our art, the music, the poetry, the images that speak of what it felt like to be human? Or is it our history of mistakes, our catalogue of warnings, the ethical codes born from centuries of conflicts and learning? And the most difficult question of all, who gets to decide? The story of Shuruppak, we realize, was never just about the past. It is a timeless problem, an ancient question that has now finally become our own. The challenge is not merely technical, a matter of building a better storage device. The challenge is one of wisdom, of choosing what to remember. In the end, the myth of the flood is not a simple record of disaster. It is a profound and unsettling mirror. It forces us to define what is most valuable about ourselves by making us decide what we would save for a world that does not yet exist. With that question to carry with us, let's take one last look at the city that gave it to us. And so, we return to where the story touches the earth, to a low mound in the Mesopotamian plain, baked by 5,000 years of sun. Here at Tell Fara, the urgent questions of our journey can finally settle into a quiet reflection. We began this investigation with a line of script, carved into a small clay prism, a sentence that acted as a knife, cutting the old world from the new. From that line we found a name, and from that name we found this city buried in the dust. We held its memory in our hands, baked into hundreds of administrative tablets that spoke of a civilization that knew how to count, how to store, and how to plan for tomorrow. Into that orderly world we heard the echo of a mythic warning, a secret whispered through a reed wall, demanding an impossible sacrifice. We traced the shape of that pressure through the layers of the story, feeling the cost of survival. Then we looked for the water itself and found its scar in the soil, a sterile layer of silt that proved this land had known the power of the river. To understand what is lost, we travelled to another continent, and saw in the footprints of white sands and the great earthworks of Poverty Point and Cahokia how deep time and profound human stories can hide just beneath our feet. Through all of it, we learned that a story does not have to be a literal report to be true. It can preserve the memory of a real pressure, the constant threat of the water, the terror of a world washed away, and compress it into a warning that survives for millennia. The city of Shuruppak, then, is more than just a place. It has become a symbol. It is the boundary marker on the edge of the map of memory, a fragile line drawn between a world that was and the story that survived of it. Its journey teaches us a new kind of respect, not for grand monuments that fall, but for the small, durable things, the baked clay, the carved stone, the carefully chosen words, that manage to carry a piece of a world across the devastating breaks in time. And so we are left with the final, quiet meaning of the vessel built in its shadow. We return in the end to where we began, to a small object of baked clay, about 20 by 9 centimetres, covered in the dense, wedge-shaped marks of a forgotten language, the Weld-Blundell Prism. It's not just an artifact, it's a key, a small key that opens a very large idea. Through our entire journey, from a line in a list to a city in the dust, to a warning through a wall, to a layer of silt in the earth, we have been following the tracks of a single question: what has to survive? And the deepest layer of the tradition gives us an answer. Survival is not just about floating until the water goes down. It is not merely endurance. It is about what is carried inside the vessel. It's about remembering well. The animals and the seeds were the hardware of the old world. But the skills of the craftspeople, the memory of the seasons, the stories of the gods, the wisdom passed from a father to a son, that was the operating system. The Ark's true cargo was continuity. It was the toolkit for building the next world, salvaged from the wreckage of the last one. The story of Shuruppak, that last city before the flood, is not ultimately about a boat.